Tag TV and Tag Radio be seen and heard by both technology users and technology producers throughout the state of Georgia and around the world. Low cost, big benefits, powerhouse online branded video and audio has arrived. Tag TV, Tag Radio, there's a lot more to know. Greetings, everyone. It's Tuesday, January 28, 2014, and this is Tech Talk with Technology Association of Georgia President Tino Mantello. I'm your guest host, Frank Baia. Up to the Tech Talk, Diana McKenzie, partner and chair of the Information Technology and Outsourcing Department of Hunter Maclean in Savannah. Diana has for nearly 30 years negotiated complex technology contracts in 5 continents, with deals ranging from $30 million to $500 million. It's all about information technology and outsourcing in a world full of details, demands, deals, and the unexpected. As we meet partner and chair of Information Technology and Outsourcing at Hunter Maclean, the largest law firm in Savannah, attorney Diana McKenzie. Diana, welcome to Tech Talk.
Glad to be here.
I think we're going to take an interesting opportunity and maybe approach the subject a little bit different, and that is I think a lot of people are kind of somewhat familiar, certainly not as a subject matter expert as you are, in technology law, but I thought it might be entertaining and interesting to our listeners to talk about some of the actual situations. You know, for example, what would be one of the more surprising situations you've encountered in negotiating technology contracts?
Well, I think probably the most surprising is the lack of understanding of what certain vendors are willing to do. So, for example, one of the deals that we did fairly recently, the CIO and his lawyer came up to us and told us they had a great deal. They had a 50% discount from this vendor, and they were just thrilled. And the funny thing was, and the surprising thing was that vendor typically in our deals was giving around a 92% discount. So they weren't even close. But that's the kind of thing I think that can be surprising both for the client and for us.
Gotcha, literally. Well, let's talk a little bit about, 5 continents of experience. Nearly 30 years, as I understand that you've been at this craft. What are some of the unique deals that you've negotiated?
Probably the most unique deal was one we did in Oman quite a few years back. And the reason that one was very unusual was because we had to get royalty to agree to the terms of the deal after we were done. Apparently in that country.
Does royalty have to agree to terms of anything? I think that's
in Oman they do, or at least at the time we did it they did. And that was something very new to us, and you had to have the right person go to royalty to explain the terms and why the deal was appropriate, and it was just a whole new dimension that I hadn't experienced.
The protocol must have been amazing, I'm sure. You had to do a little bit of homework to understand the culture?
That's right.
Well, let's maybe go into a little bit more detail about some of the experience as far as that experience is concerned. When you're dealing with international law, certainly you're not dealing with a level of consistency. Certainly there's a certain level of logic, experience, understanding. When we're dealing with a lot of technology, you're dealing with things that are not, just by their nature, not restricted by border. Tell me just the challenges of dealing with multiple cultures in on one side, a relatively static environment to a degree, minus innovation, but then having to reflect to the individual's laws and culture.
Well, when you go from country to country, if the contract's going to be governed by anything other than U.S. law, you have to engage a lawyer from that country to make sure you don't fall into some unusual trap. For example, in India, you would never want to have a contract without an arbitration clause in it, because otherwise the contract literally, if it ever got litigated, would be longer to litigate than it would be for you or I to raise a child through college. So you have to get some local expertise in when you're doing international deals.
Well, is U.S. law pervasive, or do you run into it as a catch-as-catch-can?
It, by and large, I would say, most of the deals we see are deals with U.S. companies, and they demand that U.S. law govern. So I would say that would be the most common of the deals we see.
Is that I'm totally naive. I would often say in a lot of the subjects we talk about on Tech Talk that I come as a tourist, I've done plenty of U.S. contracts in domestic marketplaces, but not have the opportunity to deal internationally. Is that part of the negotiation? If you're dealing with an international entity and a U.S. company, do you fight is it, I'm going to assume, better to play on our playing field and to have to deal with theirs?
By and large, the answer to that is yes, because the laws in the U.S. are a bit more predictable in terms of protecting intellectual property, how the litigation's going to work if that ever comes to pass. And, frankly, the large U.S. companies are more comfortable with something that they know.
Sure, I would assume. Well, now, I guess we're talking about arm wrestling to a degree. Certainly, I'm sure there's a lot of finesse in negotiating, but I'll bet you there's some fun as well. So maybe let's get into a little bit about describing, say, some of the more fun contracts you've had to negotiate.
Yeah, one of the really fun ones will be a familiar concept anyway to anybody that lives in Georgia or in the Southeast generally, really. And that was a call center contract. But the interesting thing about this contract, and it was half of it was in India and the other half of it was in Manila in terms of the staffing of the call center. But the interesting part of the deal wasn't that. It was that the customer wanted anybody that answered the phone in those two countries to know precisely what had happened in the college football games over the weekend. So we spent a great deal of time in that contract coming up with a training program and ways that they would, from a technology standpoint, know, who won in the SEC or the ACC that weekend and who had a great play and who really wasn't so great, and where the calls were good and bad. And we had all sorts of requirements about how they trained their folks on football games so that everybody that could answer that phone was up to date, half a world away, on the ins and outs of the weekend football schedule.
Talk about predictive analytics. I mean, having to go into the big data enough to be able to know the calls by the referees, I think that's pretty smart strategy as far as customer service is concerned. We often talk about how quick and how the speed of everything is increasing so rapidly. It's almost a cliche, but we'll say dynamic and dynamic fluidity, and I think lately we're actually talking about exponential and phantasmagoric because things change so quickly. In the face of those kind of evolutions, in the face of that kind of revolution, how do you hold steadfast in agreements and yet deal with the constant flow of change and innovation?
Well, you're always going to have a lot of that in any contract, a lot of changes. And one of the things you do typically is put in a process for how you're going to handle, particularly in long-term contracts, innovation and technological improvements that will impact either service levels or other critical components of the contract. And those are just woven right in. Depending on the complexity of the deal, you can have something very short, or you can wind up having something that's literally pages and pages long.
I guess the burden to be the subject expert when it comes to law falls on you, but when it comes to the evolution of market change or the impact of disruptive technologies or those kind of things, you either really can't predict it or you depend more on the client to kind of give you that sense of direction?
Well, it's some of that, and it's some from the vendor. I mean, because they typically will know, under confidentiality restrictions, what's coming, or what they anticipate changing, or things of that nature. And let's not forget, it can be not just disruptive technologies; it can also be disruptive law. When the HIPAA regulations, for example, first came in, that made a mess of a ton of contracts that had to be renegotiated, repriced, re-everything to account for some dramatic changes in how we could do business here in the United States.
I guess I'm probably getting too colorful, but I'm thinking to myself, you probably even got some changes in administration. I'm not talking domestically, but internationally, that can happen kind of overnight. So the laws could change radically, and you would have to deal with the consequences of an administration change under those circumstances. To a degree, we've talked a little bit about...
and pricing too, right? I mean, because international currency can be issues as well. Yeah.
So do you get any sleep at night worrying about all these things? I mean, it's like, how can it? Where does it stop? We talk about. I'm thinking like Star Trek and three-level chess. When you get into these negotiations, you've got to figure. It's almost like not to minimize it, but it's like some extensive animation video game or something. I mean, what do you guess and how do you figure and how do you think it out? That's pretty complex when you actually peel back the onion skin. We talked a little bit about unexpected challenges. Obviously, we've talked about the cultural aspects, and now we've talked a little bit about even things like monetary aspects of it. But is there anything else that we haven't uncovered as far as in your experience that you classify as really just something that is a wow factor, unexpected, that comes up?
Yeah, we've had a bunch of those. I mean, for example, when we were doing a deal in Brazil a few years ago, we had a translator that turned out wasn't a very good translator, and so a lot of the deal was getting really bent off of shape, and no one really quite understood why.
That's great.
Yeah, and I tend to tell a lot of jokes just to kind of ease things up, and the jokes would be, people would be laughing like 6 minutes after I told the joke, and the whole thing was just crazy, and I learned from that deal how to find an excellent translator.
I would think that would probably be critically important. When you see that the hard negotiations are getting really hard and the guy keeps smiling, you got to be thinking maybe he's telling him what he wants to hear.
Right. Another example I'll give you of an unexpected challenge happened here in the U.S., and this was a very large deal and an extremely competitive deal between two very, very large consulting firms that I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast would know the answer to, would know these two vendors. And it was it was a lot of money at stakes, but what one of the vendors decided to do was to buy the company of the independent consultant that the client had hired to advise them on which vendor to pick. That was a big surprise. I mean, no one really anticipated what we thought was our neutral source turned out not to be so terribly neutral.
I can't, again, I'm overwhelmed by the complexity, and really, you can't, you talk about unexpected. I mean, you just have to constantly think in terms of what is going to happen next all the time. Now,
you got to be doing a lot of research and staying up to date, that's for sure.
Well, certainly the message is clear. You don't go about it doing it by yourself, that's for sure, and you want to make sure you've got a trusted ally that has had enough experience to not just be going through it for the first time, but has the knowledge to know that you better know the football score, or just possibly who purchased the consulting company might be part of the strategy of the negotiation. That's pretty amazing. We're quickly running out of time, but I was just thinking as you were talking, there's so many reality programs on TV now, and there's so many things that seem to go inside businesses, and I'm certainly thinking of things like Shark Tank, and I think Profit now is talking a lot about. Is there anything that you can think of that some of our listeners could relate to? Say, for example, I know it's kind of a totally off-the-wall question, but a TV show that kind of gives anyone that would be watching an example of what large contract negotiations are like?
Yeah, actually there's one that's about perfect, and it's called Survivor. And the reason for that in these really large transactions, what we found is the most effective way to get through them quickly is to have a lot of vendors at first and decrease the number of vendors with each round, so that you may start with 6 vendors, and then the second round you have 5 vendors, and so forth, until you get down to 2. And it really increases a lot of the serious negotiation and decreases some of the fluffing that would otherwise go on when you have multiple parties, because no one wants to be eliminated in the next round.
Well, you've changed the picture now, and I'm thinking instead of boardrooms, I'm wondering it isn't on an island, and I'm trying to think it isn't a Chanel suit or a Brooks Brothers outfit. It may well be some kind of a survival outfit just to be able to take on the battlefield. And I know I'm kidding around, but I think the analogy is really fascinating when you look at it from that, the complexity that you present in terms of the challenges and the dynamics, and yet the, I wouldn't say simplistic, but certainly clear focus of how you go about kind of navigating through that maze by thinking it in terms of survivor is kind of fascinating. Well, obviously, we always say this, and that is the good ones seem to go so quick. Our time is quickly running out. Diana, thank you so much in allowing us to kind of play around a little bit and go from a different perspective on IT law, but also one I think is a little bit more incisive than the average discussion. Thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to join us today.
Thanks for the invitation to connect. I had fun.